I'm Viktor, just setting the vibe a little bit for the talk there. I'm going to talk about vibe coding full stack Dart today. I used to work on the Flutter team way back when I lived in Silicon Valley. Now I'm the founder of ServerPod and working on making Dart better on the back end every day. So vibe coding, let's first get a little bit of a definition of what it is. So it was initially coined by Andrei Karpathy, and I'm not going to write his whole tweet, but some parts of it. There's a new kind of coding I call vibe coding, where you fully give in to the vibes, embrace exponentials, and forget that the code even exists. I accept all, always. When I get error messages, I just copy-paste them in with no comment. Sometimes the LLMs can't fix a bug, so I just work around it or ask for random changes until it goes away. So this is like the purest form of vibe coding, right? You don't even look at the code. But when people talk about vibe coding, they talk about a few different things. So the first one, only prompting, never looking at the code, right? The second one is sort of prompting, reviewing the code, and doing occasional manual fixes. So that's a bit more what we're going to talk about today, because we're all developers, right? We can look at the code. And some will talk about more just using the autocomplete in something like cursor as vibe coding. But I'm going to look more into the prompting, having a look at the code. Although in this talk, thinking of it, I don't show any code. So maybe the first lecture you have today where you don't have to look at code. Right, so first, there are like a bunch of tools to work when you do vibe coding or generate code, right? We have Cursor, Dreamflow, probably the sort of vibe codiest, together with Firebase, where you don't really need to look at the code. Then we have Gemini CLI, of course, Claude Code, Codex, and many of these plug into VS Code, or Cursor is like a clone of VS Code, of course. But I'm not going to talk too much about the tools because, they change every week, literally. So what is best? I'm more thinking about, when you learn programming, you don't really learn a programming language. You're more maybe better working with the principles. So that's more what we're going to talk about today. And the first and most important part when you do vibe coding is to get a great context. And the context is, all the information you patch into an LLM or an agent that it uses to generate your code. Because the models, they only know the things that it's been trained on. It doesn't really have a memory. It's not familiar with your code base. So anything you put in your code, if you wanted to write code as you wanted to, you may need to put that in the context of the agent or the model. And with a better context, you get way better output of your code. But there's a problem with putting everything you have in your context, because the bigger the context you provide to an LLM, the worse it will perform. And this is true for, seems like, all the models today. This is like half a year old, and the models have improved a little bit since then. But even at like 32,000 tokens, the performance of the model has already significantly declined, right? So imagine you put like 1 million tokens in there, it will be even worse. So we want to keep our context as small and compact as possible and just get the best stuff in there. And there are a couple of ways we can get the context to our agents and to our LLMs. And that's through our project files. So the agents will very often look and search your project and see what you've done before and sort of imitate that. And that's great because it helps us get code that looks more similar to the stuff we've done before. We can also work with something called a PRD, which is a product requirements document and an implementation plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we have something called an AGENTS.md that most of these coding agents use, where you can give extra instructions to the model, and that's the first file it loads into its context. So it's very important. And finally, we have something called MCP servers, or Model Context Protocol servers. They can also help bring a better context to your model. Let's first look at the product requirements document. And this may be a little bit daunting to write like a requirements document for your application. So why not use the agent to do that? And this is a prompt I used. Basically, write the product requirements document, or PRD.md. I'm building a conference app with Flutter and ServerPod, and I want to have 3 types of users: attendees, speakers, and admins. And then you basically describe your app. And the LLM or the agent will put together a pretty good PRD for you from this. So the things you want to make sure you get into that, obviously you need to add a little bit more details about what you want to build than in that short example. But make sure you have a good description of the app and all the features you want to have covered, the technologies that you are planning to use, including, which state management you are planning to use, or which packages, stuff like that. Any design UX considerations, if you have any special type of models or data that you want to have in there, that's also great to get into this document. Next, we can use this PRD to construct a plan for how we're going to build our app. And we can do this, obviously, with the agent again. So we can say something like, I'm building an app, look at the requirements in the PRD.md, and make a full step-by-step implementation plan, plan.md. Include a checklist for each step at the end. And having that checklist is pretty good, because that allows the agent to know, how much of the plan is already implemented, and you can check off each step that we build. So, right, next we can have a look at this AGENTS.md, and I have some tips for how to make that work better. It's the first thing, the AGENTS.md, you put it just in the root of your project. And it's the very first thing that the agent will include in the context, so it's very important. The models typically pay more attention to the stuff that's early in the context and at the end of the context. So whatever you put in the agents is therefore very important. And typically, what I found works really well is having a short description of your project. Then you have references to the PRD and to the implementation plan, so the LLM always know where to look for that. And then having some instructions for how to write tests is also super helpful. And you can typically tell it, like, write the test after every feature we implement. Yeah, depending on your model or what you use, you can get pretty good tests, actually. And something that's really useful to have in there is also telling it when to use and how to use MCP servers. Otherwise, it may not even look at those. And then you can add more context yourself, because you don't want to load everything that you want the agent to have knowledge of in the agents file, because that would be huge. So you want it to just fill up the stuff that it actually needs. So you can put more things in the .agents directory. This is not like an official standard, but like something that many use. And if you reference that from AGENTS.md, the models or agents will know where to look for that. For instance, I built an app with that used ShedCN, if you know that. It's a UI library that has a specific style if you don't necessarily want to work with material design. But the models are not super well trained on that. So what I did, I used another prompt to pull all the documentation from ShedCN. So what I did is I asked it to clone the documentation for ShedCN UI from GitHub, then find all code example, create an individual markdown file for each widget with a minimal example of its usage, and then place it into the .agents ShedCN UI directory. And then I can just reference that from the agents file, so it knows where to find this, and tell it to look at the specific components, and always look there before it starts using any material design widgets. Otherwise, it will be super happy to just mix everything up. And the output I got from this is this is an example, maybe a little bit small to see super well, but on the left-hand side, you can see all the different components. So you have accordion, alerts, avatars, badges, everything. And I just opened the button file, so you can see a few examples of the buttons. So it has an example for a primary button, a secondary button, a destructive button, and this is true for all the different components, got a short little example. And the LLMs typically love seeing examples of code, much more than just having instructions for doing things. It's much happier and does a much better job if you give it examples, it seems. And another tip for your agents file is whenever you do some generated code, and it will inevitably get things wrong, right? All the time you get wrong stuff. So what you can do is when it gets something wrong, tell it about that in the AGENTS.md file. So you basically do an iteration and then add a few more rules there, tell it how to do a thing, and next try it again. And next time you come to a similar problem, usually there's a much higher chance it gets it right. So it's the agents don't have a memory, right? So this is their memory, and you may want to manage that a little bit yourself to get it right. All right, next we are going to have a look at MCP servers. And that's the Model Context Protocol. So it's basically a small little server. It can either be like a CLI process or an HTTP server. I think most commonly it's a CLI tool. And it's a standardized way for the agents to extend their context. So most of the different agents like Gemini CLI, Cursor, Firebase Studio, I think all of them supports the same protocol, which is very convenient. So you can just plug these tools into your agent. And the MCP server can provide tools, resources, and prompts. So tools can be any sort of structured queries. It's basically a JSON query that you send to a specific tool in the MCP server and get a response back. And it can also do things. For instance, you have the Dart MCP server that can run pubget, Dart test, stuff like that. The resources are just like basically text blocks, or I guess it could be images or any sort of static files. And prompts are templates for prompts. In practice, the agents, they only use tools. So if you write an MCP server, I started adding resources and stuff, couldn't get it to use it at all. So make everything as tools is my my tip if you do an MCP server. But if you look at the actual tools like Dart provides, it's nice to have, but and maybe makes things a tad bit more efficient. But as it turns out, the agents are pretty good at running CLI tools anyway, so it knows how to do Dart test. So I think my feeling there gives not that great of a value, but if you have an MCP server that can provide more context to your model, that can be way more useful. So let's look at how we at ServerPod made vibe coding great for Dart on the back end and the steps we took. And these are like lessons maybe you can apply to the project you're working on, even if you're not doing ServerPod necessarily. But for you that are new to ServerPod, I'll just give you a super quick introduction of what we're actually doing. So ServerPod is an open source, scalable app server written in Dart for the Flutter community, which means that you can write your whole stack in Dart, which is great if you're a Flutter developer. And we made it so you basically add methods into an endpoint class on the server. So that's the top example here. We have a hello method, and then you run serverpod generate, and out comes a client that you import into your Flutter app. So calling those methods on the server is just like calling a local method in your app, which is super cool. And here we return a future, but you can return a stream to do real-time communication or serializable objects and stuff like that. It's scalable, so you can start building it as a hobby project. It's all open source, free, and it will scale to millions of users, no problem. We are building a serverpod cloud, so you can deploy it with zero configuration. That will be available in a public beta later this year. And we built it also for AI native apps. So both we're building this vibe coding tools, so MCP servers for serverpod, but we also have support for things like vector databases, which is great for when you're working with LLMs and need to look up data from a semantical search and stuff like that. And it comes with batteries included. So you have like all type of features you need, like database support, authentication, caching, health checks. You can stream data, schedule tasks if something needs to happen in the future, uploading files, logging, and a complete testing framework. So we've been working on this for more than 3 years, and we're a team of 11 people. So it's a pretty serious product. And one of the things we built with serverpod and for serverpod is something we call Star Guide. So it's a way to basically search our documentation, but with an LLM. And the way this works is you just type in a prompt, and we send it to our server, and then we have a vector database where we stored all our documentation, but also we're storing all discussions from GitHub with answers and issues that are filed. So you don't just search the documentation like a normal search, but you can find all this information. And then we have an LLM look through all those documents and see what's relevant to your question and can give you a good answer back. And this is what we used when we built our MCP server for serverpod. So basically, it works like this. So you're coding in Cursor and or any other agent, and it may get stuck somewhere. And then it can ask the MCP server, like, hey, how do I do this authentication thing? Or how do I migrate the database table? And it can ask that with natural language, send that question to the MCP server, which then forwards it to StarGuide, looks it up in the vector database, finds relevant documentation, formats it nicely for the LLM on the way back, all the way to Cursor. And then usually it can just figure it out for us. So that's something that worked really, really well for us. We also added like documents that are specifically written for LLMs with, this is like the basics of serverpod, like the key features that you use, that it always loads in the beginning of its context when you working with serverpod. And then you have a little note in the AGENTS.md that gives it that hint to find it. All right, so that's how we built our MCP server for serverpod. But what else should you think about when you go with vibes? And I have a few little pointers. First, choose the right model for the job. I think I've tried a bunch of different tools. The ones I've used most are Gemini CLI. I tried out Codex, which works as a plugin to VS Code, and Cursor. And the one I've been happiest with is Cursor with ChatGPT 5. I think that worked pretty well. The only thing, it's really slow. So when you have a quick, simple task, I typically switch to something like Grok, because it's like lightning fast, but it's also, if you do something simple, it will be fine. But if you try do something more advanced, it will go like all over the place. So I'm sure you experienced that at some point. So if you need a quick correction, you can just switch to Grok, do it, but doing something bigger, usually GPT-5. But typically it works much better if you do small little changes to your code. And so with developers, I would like review the code it writes. And, you know, after a while, think about if is this like a fix that's faster to fix myself, or should I really ask the LLM one more time? Because when you're done like your fourth iteration, you're like, it's so stupid. Uh, and then you'd build something else, and it's like, how did it even do this? How did it figure it out? So I think that can be pretty cool. I actually experimented with giving it as small like queries or prompts as possible to see how much it managed to figure it out. And sometimes it's really stunning you, and then it tries to do something simple and just gets stuck. So if you're doing this like for real, think about like, don't trust the LLM too much and don't be too lazy yourself. That's my advice. And keep improving the context so you always can iterate on that, and that will give you better results over time. But it often makes mistakes, and there's some common mistakes that you typically should look out for, I think. It loves taking shortcuts. If it's solving a problem, I'm sure you've seen it tries to do it in the easiest possible way, but probably not the way you want it sometimes. So watch out for that, and maybe in your prompt, give it some more hints on how to do something, not just what to do. It loves to repeat code. Sometimes it writes like almost identical methods on top of each other. So that's something typically pretty bad. It's like coding style doing copy paste, but LLMs love that. And it often won't find like pre-existing widgets, constants, methods. So that's also something you may need to point out when you're coding. So for instance, I mean, one of the biggest advantages of Flutter and widgets is that you can reuse them in different parts of your app, right? The LLMs love to write new stuff all the time, rather than adding a property to an existing widget and just piping it into the right place. So watch out for that. And I mean, with some smart prompting, you can get it to do it right. Same with constants, methods. You may need to point it out and do like an extra iteration if you don't want to do it yourself. I often do like overcomplicated stuff and just too much code. So yeah, don't be afraid to dig in yourself sometimes. And it misses edge cases, I think, especially when it comes to testing. It can skip like the edge cases there and just do the happy path of testing, basically. I wanted to share some examples of what I vibe coded. The first one is something that I felt scared a lot of Flutter developers. The end or the start of this summer, and that is iOS 26 with all the liquid glass stuff. So I thought maybe it's worth trying this out if it's possible to do with platform channels and actually draw the components in there. I've never coded Swift. I've done a lot of iOS development work, but that was back in the Objective-C days. So I didn't want to spend a week learning Swift and then figuring out how to do platform channels. But I managed to do that with an LLM. And as it turns out, it's actually pretty fast. So in a weekend, I managed to just vibe code a prototype for how you could integrate liquid glass with Flutter. So that's pretty cool, and something that I think we should bring into Flutter for real. Obviously, it only works on iOS and macOS, but still, if you want to have a native feel, possible to do, can be good to know. So I think it probably took me a couple of weeks to do that from scratch if I had done it, and now I could do it in the weekend, but I wouldn't use it in production, let's put it that way. Every view works a little bit different. The APIs are so. But it works as a demo. The next thing I've been doing is we're going to host a full stack Flutter conference online, probably in February. And we did it a year and a half ago, and it was so much work we did it like Google Forms and stuff. So I'm basically vibe coding a conference app, and that's easier. It's more clear code, but here I've been like reviewing it and more generating the code, and I use this as a project to improve working with ServerPod, like the MCP server. So this is built with Flutter and ServerPod, and then when I got stuck, I improved the MCP server. So it's like that's how I built the MCP server step by step, making sure it works in most cases. So is it worth it? I think some cases definitely yes. I mean, it will speed up your backend coding, writing tests, boilerplate code, and UI, obviously. Great for prototyping, exploring ideas, like the native Cappuccino library I vibed together. Wouldn't have had the time to do that otherwise. But keep in mind that like the AI code often is messy or incorrect. And you still own the testing, debugging, the security of your app. So you're kind of responsible for whatever the LLM spits out. And it spits out a lot of security holes in its code sometimes. And yeah, so I think another risk is also not just the security, but it makes you a little bit lazy, right? After a while, you prompt the LLM 5 times instead of just changing 3 lines of code. And that's probably not the best. And it kind of, sometimes it spits out so much code, so it kind of wears you down, right? Just the reviews. So I don't know, for a real application, up to you, see if it works, but I think there's a balance to be had. So will this be the future of coding? I was more skeptical like a year ago, but it has improved, I think, the usefulness of it a lot with the past year. But at the same time, I have a feeling that it may be sort of hitting the ceiling of its capabilities. I asked ChatGPT to make the next slide, so take this with a grain of salt. But it shows the cost of training the models versus how good they are, or how accurate the models are. And you can see that on the line. So like the more money, basically, the better the model. But there's a but here, that if you look at the x-axis, which is the cost, it's logarithmic, right? So for every step up, it's like an order of magnitude more expensive and requires a lot more data, a lot more computing. So taking us to like GPT-6, will that be like 10 times the amount of data, compute, money? And then like GPT-7, will that be like 100 times? They're already using all the compute they possibly can to train these models, right? So that may be a hard thing to do. I think I'm not too worried about our jobs yet. Let's put it that way. And probably before programmers are replaced, the programmers will replace all the accountants, all the lawyers, everyone else. Who else is going to do that work? So anyway, if you want to try this out, the MCP server for ServerPod is up on PubDev with some instructions for how to get started. ServerPod MCP, easy to remember. I am Viktor Lidholt. You can find me on Twitter if you want to connect. I'm on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and ServerPod, serverpod.dev, or X or Blue Sky. You can find us there, or come talk with us in our booth downstairs. So that's what I had for you. With that, I'm open for any questions you may have.